Well, I think it was really nice to start with our things that are positive that we share, and bringing light to that because it just makes it even brighter, all that's good. But I think it's time to take a hard turn, both in terms of subject and mood, and that is to explore our common challenges, which are rooted in the same playbook of recycled stereotypes and slurs. But before we get started, how about we take another poll? Yes or no? Have you experienced anti-Semitism or Hinduphobia? Wow. Over 90% have.
Wow. So we're right on target with our discussion here. Anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia. We have parts of the definition here. Anti-Semitism, as we shall see, mutates into different forms, and sometimes it's difficult to identify. There is an International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition and 11 examples, which include classic and contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism. And at the end of our presentation, we'll give you a link so that you can look at these definitions in detail and learn more about them.
Well, Hinduphobia is a set of antagonistic, destructive, and derogatory attitudes and behaviors towards Hinduism and Hindus that may manifest as prejudice, fear, or hatred. This is a working definition that was developed by an initiative called Understanding Hinduphobia that brought together a number of scholars from different fields. The definition and the examples, or more examples rather, can be found at www.understandinghinduphobia.org. And we at the Hindu American Foundation also developed a glossary because oftentimes we found that a lot of Hinduphobic words are used in the media and by academicians, and the average person in the public doesn't even know that these are slurs. So that was kind of a product that we made inspired by this definition.
It's so important to define the terms if we're ever going to defeat them. And so this International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, or IRA, I think it's important for everybody to find out what it is, and so there's an understanding. But when we put the definitions side by side, we see striking similarities. Both call out hatred toward our respective religions, distortions of our teachings and practices, dehumanizing Jews and Hindus.
Yeah, there's also accusations of dual loyalty to either India and Israel. There's Hindus and Jews being portrayed as violent or warmongers. And then there's a denial of atrocities committed against us, amongst many other commonalities. As we continue tonight, we'll share more details on some of the examples with images given with these definitions.
Many ways in which Judaism is distorted and has been distorted, but I'll look at two: deicide and blood libel. In the early years of the Christian church, the Jews were condemned for rejecting the teachings of Jesus. But worse, were accused of slaying the Christian Messiah and have been held collectively responsible for the action. Now, what can be worse than being the killer of God? But we see modern images of Israelis crucifying a Palestinian Jesus. So the imagery of deicide, which is the most awful thing you can do, continues. There's also blood libel. Judaism forbids drinking any blood at all. Yet since ancient times, Jews have been falsely accused of killing non-Jews, especially Christian children, for ritual purposes. In medieval Europe, it was often accompanied by accusations that Jews used their victims' blood to make matzah for the Jewish holiday of Passover. These false allegations have been followed by anti-Jewish riots and mass murder. And today, we can hear the echoes of the blood libel in allegations that Jews, especially in Israel, intentionally kill Arab children.
Well, If what you know about Hinduism is something that you learned in your 6th or 9th grade world history class, I'm here to report that's probably mostly distorted. The distortions about Hinduism date back to centuries of colonial rule, and unfortunately, it remains the dominant lens through which Hinduism is taught about, spoke about, portrayed in public school textbooks, in the academia, in media and pop culture. What we Hindus call it in shorthand is a caste cow's curry or a caste cow's karma approach to inaccurately and reductively trying to define Hinduism. It's a narrative that portrays Hindus and Hinduism as racist, primitive, poor, and absurd. I'm going to go a little bit into details of these 3 C's. So, caste. Nearly every social evil in India is blamed on a deliberate misunderstanding of Hindu texts and teachings, including a false interpretation that Hindu teachings mandate an oppressive, rigid, discriminatory pan-Indian caste system. It does not. There's in this narrative a special hatred for Brahmins. These are individuals who traditionally engaged in religious study and ritual. Now, interestingly enough, here's another commonality, but the demonization of Indian religious leaders is rooted in Protestant bias and widespread Christian animosity towards Jews of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. So any torchbearer of a backward and heathen religion like Hinduism was equated with their perceived Jewish counterpart, especially by German Indologists. I want to talk about cows. Now, some cows may describe the reverence of the cow, which is seen as a symbol of Earth, Mother Earth, and selfless compassion as worship. But cow worshiper, when used by non-Hindus and anti-Hindu actors, which can include Hindus, which I know we'll talk about later, about how oftentimes how Hinduphobia or anti-Semitism comes from within our own communities, it is a slur. Now, historically, the Mughal conquest to the Inquisition to partition, public killing of cows, desecration of Hindu, Sikh, and Jain temples with slaughtered cow flesh and blood, the wrapping of Hindu and Sikh warrior bodies in cow carcasses, and force feeding of beef after forcible conversions have all been means of asserting political power and domination by non-Hindus over Hindus. The last area of distortion that we see quite commonly is that of karma. Karma, or Hindus rather, are portrayed as cruel, selfish, and uncharitable through a misinterpretation of karma as a fatalistic system where Hindus see that they have no duty to uplift others from suffering because somehow we think they deserve it because of their past karma. This is an absolute distortion of what karma really is.
So we go from misinterpreting religion a step further. The hate logic is Jews killed God. Thus, well, if there is logic to hate, so Jews killed God, therefore Jews are the devil. During the Middle Ages, Jews were frequently described as children of the devil, and they were portrayed with horns and bulging eyes. There's actually some very famous artwork with Moses and having horns. In my first year at university, there was a lovely young woman from a small town, and her room was a few doors down from mine in the dorm. I noticed her staring at my hair. Now, in those days, I wore this large bouffant hairdo. So at the beginning, I thought she was staring because she thought it was so beautiful. But then she kept looking at my hair. So I finally asked her, "Why are you looking at my hair?" And she said, "I can't find the horns." So I was shocked, but that idea hasn't really gone away. So if you can see the image on the right from a recent anti-Israel event, today this anti-Semitic tropes of Jews being the devil persists. Later, we'll look at how that trope or idea translates into violence.
So just as Jews, as you shared, Peggy, are depicted as devils rather. Hindus are depicted as devil worshippers. And this expression of contempt is used in some Christian and Muslim rhetoric. They view Hindu gods and goddesses as satanic. And it's rooted in the claim of religious supremacy and exclusivity of salvation and access to God that they believe can only come through Christianity and Islam. Now, modern iterations of this are seen coming from religious conservatives who are really worried about the popularity of yoga. And that's where this image comes from. In June of 2022, so just this year, this article was talking about how E.W. Jackson, the Republican candidate for Virginia's lieutenant governor and a Christian minister, said that, quote, doing yoga may leave unsuspecting people vulnerable to satanic possession. We see a lot of this. And incidentally, we had an initiative many years ago about bringing to light yoga's Hindu roots. This is one of those strange places that we're in complete agreement oftentimes with religious conservatives who are saying, yes, yoga is Hindu, but the agreement stops there. Their next point is, yeah, because it's Hindu, you shouldn't engage in it, as opposed to, for us, it's just a matter of bringing acknowledgement to one of the great contributions of Hindu civilization to the world.
So this hatred of Hindus, of Jews, is not only from a religious base. We also see it as racism. Now, with the beginning of the Enlightenment, religion lost some of its stronghold and science became the ultimate source of truth. And that should have been good news for us. But the scientific theory of Darwinism morphed into social Darwinism, and the notion that some races can be scientifically proven superior and others inferior was dangerous. Now, Jews were the inferior race, depicted as ugly and dirty and often less than human, some kind of insect. This degrading of Jews into a lesser form of life was perfected by the propaganda in Nazi Germany. They even called the mass murder of 6 million Jews extermination, conjuring up the image of exterminating insects. Today, conversely, there's still racism, but Jewishness is associated with a false sense of white racial superiority. Over half the Jews in Israel are not of Ashkenazi or European white background, but don't let facts get in the way. But shortly before her death in 2019, my mother, Holocaust survivor, heard a women's rights activist disparagingly calling Jews privileged whites. My father was stunned. She almost smiled as she said, they killed my whole family because we were not white, and now they tell me I'm white? So anti-Jewish racism has not been eradicated. It's just changed colors.
Well, you know, what happens is that once you dehumanize a group of people, it's really easy to subjugate them, abuse them, and kill them. And that's exactly what this tweet demonstrates. The reply tweet is a good example where it starts by listing Hindus as bastards, as, you know, piss drinking, cow piss drinking, and how we're ugly. And he literally uses the word subhuman to justify that Hindus are better off being dead. Now, I think that's shocking in and of itself. What's more shocking to me is that it was a reply tweet. The original tweet comes from the stories editor based in Delhi for National Public Radio.
We're going to see here that the haters are not only vicious, sometimes they lack creativity. When we look at these two images, since medieval times, Jewry has been depicted as wealthy, cunning, untrustworthy, powerful, menacing. And the happy merchant meme on the left, the far left, has been around for a long time, but it's increasing in popularity. And in 2018, there was a study showing that this happy merchant was among the most popular memes on what's called 4chan and Gab. I never watched those or whatever, but they're two major online outlets for alt-right expression. Well, in the Middle Ages, Jews were kept out of guilds, most professions. They couldn't own land, so they turned to one of the few options, and that was banking. Now, I love Shakespeare, but Shakespeare's Shylock in The Merchant of Venice became the image of the wealthy, greedy Jewish money lender. The belief that Jews are wealthy, too wealthy, has been internalized in the general public. And according to studies, recent studies by the Anti-Defamation League, substantial percentages of respondents in almost every country they surveyed believe that Jews have too much power in business and international financial markets.
Well, a lot of the hateful notions about Hindus date back to many influential British, including James Mill, the author of a book called The History of British India. Now, this was a very influential text in that it was used to train civil servants in Britain who were going to be heading off to India. Now, the book starts with a quite haughty admission by Mr. Mill that he had never visited India, nor did he know any of its languages. And this was somehow going to prove his objectivity. Now, I'm going to read a quote that essentially gives you an idea of the overall contents of the book. He says, quote, "Hindus are full of dissimulation and falsehood, the universal concomitants of oppression, the vices of falsehood, indeed they carry to a height almost unexampled among the other races of men." So you see this depiction of Hindus as being liars, of, being prey to falsehoods, so superstitious, as well as being oppressive. So that's, a different way of saying greedy. Now, today we see a lot of these types of statements or similar statements amongst anti-immigrant and alt-right circles. And usually the refrain is that Indians and Hindus are taking over American jobs, especially in light of the number of Hindu Americans or Indian Americans who hold high positions in some of the major companies that people, have become household names for many people. Now, this image to the right is one that's found in the National Contagion Research Institute's report on Hinduphobia. And they found that anti-Hindu disinformation often was masked through the use of ethnic pejoratives, slurs, and coded language. So that happy merchant meme then finds a Hindu iteration of it, as we see here.
So we're going on to dual loyalty. One of the oldest anti-Semitic canards is that of dual loyalty, whereby Jewish citizens are accused of being more loyal to Israel or to the priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. Now, this trope has existed for thousands of years to disenfranchise, harass, and even attack Jews. The first written example is in a text, the story of Esther, which is told during our festival of Purim. To make short, Esther, beautiful Jewish woman, becomes queen, and she's able to undermine the king's viceroy's plan to have the king kill all the Jews because he had convinced the king that the Jews were disloyal. For years, Arab governments have justified their campaigns to drive out Jewish populations that had been there for 1,000 years with the charge that they were Zionists or Israeli spies. And after the establishment of the State of Israel, the slander of disloyalty had gained new momentum. You see here, there's a tweet by a U.S. representative. We hear her and other accusations of disproportionate influence of Zionists or the so-called Israel lobby, as if a foreign government had been implanted in a hostile political force inside the Capitol. The dual loyalty trope is one of the most popular anti-Semitic charges on campus. A Jewish student being considered for a student government position was publicly told in a confirmation session she could not be, quote, impartial because of her Jewish heritage. Recently, groups at Berkeley's law school voted to prohibit speakers who refuse to denounce their Zionism. Do you face dual loyalty accusations?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the Jewish community has a far longer history of it, but it's become increasingly commonplace, especially as Hindu Americans, which are largely a new immigrant community, are getting more and more involved in the public square, whether they are showing up to city councils to testify, whether they are making donations to political candidates or actually running for office. This is where, and also Hindu American institutions that might be involved in the policy space. No one is immune to these accusations of dual loyalty, especially if you wear your Hindu identity proudly or if you are a champion of US-India relations. The challenge is that it's oftentimes subtle and overlooked because it comes from other Indians and Hindus who might have political gripes with what's going on in India, as opposed to, or might even have some baseline animosity towards the Hindu tradition. And what these accusations essentially do is they raise suspicion about the Americanness of Hindu Americans. It attributes malintent. It falsely portrays us as being arms or weapons of an Indian political movement or excesses of the Indian political discourse. It oftentimes compels us to speak out or asks us to speak out against things that are happening in India. Now, I have yet to see someone of Italian heritage being asked to condemn something that happened in Italy, or someone of French heritage being asked to do the same for France. So this is a classic example of not just dual loyalty, but also a double standard. It also paints Hindu Americans as somehow inherently anti-Muslim and anti-Christian. And then, of course, our elected leaders, and we have so few, are held to a double standard. So this story here questions if Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy from Illinois was to meet with the Prime Minister of India. He's held to a different standard than President Obama or Senator Cruz or Speaker Pelosi, simply because he's Hindu.
And I think talk about Hinduphobia and global conspiracy and control. Tell us about your powers that you have.
Sure. So this is an image from a conference that occurred, gosh, I've lost track of time, maybe 1.5 or 2 years ago, called Dismantling Global Hindutva. It was organized by radical South Asian activist scholars at the University of Pennsylvania and brought together other radical activist scholars from the top universities across this country. And what it sought to do, just based on the slate of speakers, we knew that it wasn't necessarily about Hindutva, which is a term that actually has a lot of meanings, in the same way that I understand that Zionism has different meanings as well. But before even the program had maybe gone into its first session, people already were equating Hindutva with Hinduism. And in one session, the moderator literally asked, so are we really just talking about dismantling Hinduism? So if you went to the About Us page of this conference, the description fear-mongered about the large Indian diaspora, which has, quote, the potential for building links with other supremacist ideologies. So just for some context, people of Indian origin make up less than 2% of the entire American population. And Hindus are going to be a smaller subset of that. So maybe 1.2, 1.3% at best. The irony here is that global supremacist ideologies, or ideologies which have sought to seek ethnic, racial, or religious hegemony, and which have transcended national borders, meaning they have indeed been global, have been predicated on the exclusion and subjugation of religious groups like Hindus and like Jews. So, this sort of fear mongering of a global conspiracy and control is something that we see largely stemming out of the academy, from activist scholars who really should be spending more of their time doing fact-based, evidence-based research and teaching their students how to think as opposed to what to think. And one thing I want to point out is that many of the scholars that have been involved in initiatives like Dismantling Global Hindutva, you could do a cross-check of petitions supporting BDS, and I'm pretty sure you would find a lot of common names.
We did a cross check, and you do find the common names.
Yeah.
The image on the right is of an octopus with a little Jewish star controlling the world, and the outlandish claim of a Jewish conspiracy to control the world is another long-standing trope. Jews account for 0.2% of the global population, not 2%, 0.2%. And yet anti-Semites believe that this tiny minority is not only in the quest for world global domination, but we are already in the control of banks, media, industry, government, weather, and now with Kanye West's latest rantings, we're even in control of the fashion industry. The conspiracy theorists are ready to rework their accusations based on what is most hated in the particular society. In a capitalist society, Jews are blamed for being communists. In a communist regime, Jews are responsible for capitalism. No matter what, there's a sinister Jewish cabal pulling the strings. Ideas and fears about the Jewish power were codified in the early 20th century with the publication of a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That's an elaborate, ridiculous forgery, falsely reporting a meeting that never happened of Jews who were conspiring to take the world. Today, this protocol of Elders of Zion remains widely read and accepted as fact. It's you can see that Jews are and Israel are accused for virtually any contemporary catastrophe, even COVID. And this conspiracy delusion exists in the darkest corners of the internet and even in public comments made by our own legislator in full daylight. So what does this cabal, this supposed cabal, do in addition to killing God, causing illness, natural disasters? Well, Jews are blamed for causing wars and often blamed by those who caused them for making them lose. A popular claim in Nazi Germany asserted that Jews started World War II, that it was in fact declared in 1939 by Chaim Weizmann, president of the World Zionist Organization, who did not even have a gun. Nazis used this false notion to justify the murder of Jews as self-defense. Israel and Jews have been blamed more recently for the Iraq War I, Iraq War II, the attack on the World Trade Center, and even some of the situations that are going now with Ukraine and Russia. There's a heightened rhetoric in the present days. And so Israel is sometimes accused of committing acts of genocide, not only warlike, but genocide against Palestinians. Here's a reality check. Genocide reduces the targeted population. The Arab population after Israel declared independence in 1948 and 5 Arab armies attacked Israel was approximately 156,000. Today, it's almost 2 million. This is not genocide, but the sensationalist use of the term genocide in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not only inaccurate and misleading, but it serves to demonize the state. and the Jews who live in it.
That's a great point. And the problem when you misuse the word genocide is when it's actually happening. You use a word in the wrong context enough, and it can be dangerous because we're not going to be able to use the word in order to stop mass killings of people and the cleansing of people. In the Hindu context, I'm going to read two headlines from the New York Times. The first said, quote, "As Hindu extremists call for the killing of Muslims, India's leaders keep silent," end quote. And here's another one, quote, "As targeted killings spike, Hindus are desperate to flee Kashmir decades after militant violence forced many of them out of the disputed region. Hundreds of families have left in another exodus." Now, these two headlines and stories tend to describe Hindu perpetrators as Hindu militants, extremists, and vigilantes. So when militants are Islamist or Christian, well, then their religion is minimized. So what that ends up doing is creating an asymmetry where you see more and more of the word Hindu being equated with words like militant, extremist, terrorist. And when it's from another religion, they're not equated at all. And so you get a subtle, but over time, strong perception of Hindus being violent. Now, the truth is that incidents of hate speech and tensions do erupt into violence in India occasionally, but it's rarely one-sided, and it involves victims and perpetrators from a variety of backgrounds. So if we look at this headline on the right from Al Jazeera claiming an impending genocide of Muslims, is it true? Well, if we're to believe state-run media like Al Jazeera or legacy media outlets like the New York Times or the Washington Post, then yes. But if you were to listen to respected observers, from think tank experts to policymakers or the State Department, or even looking to demographics of how different religious minority populations have grown in India, or probably the best way of doing so, actually go there and see for your own eyes, then no, there is no genocide.